From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
The special partnership today, of course, is with the Veterans History Project. And I'm going to turn it over to Bob Patrick, who is the director, to introduce the program and the speakers and to move us into the multi-celebration that we're part of. Bob, Veterans History Project, Bob will explain, but it did come to the library through legislation in the year 2000. But we've been lucky to have Bob as its director since 2006. Bob has a big military career behind him, but in addition, he has a leadership role in many public kinds of projects that related to not just to the military, but really to public service. He is a graduate of the U.S. Army War College, and the project that I knew about first, and I noticed is the one that has the lead paragraph in the announcement of his coming to the Library of Congress in 2006, was a leadership role in the U.S. World War II Memorial. He was one of its officials and had an awful lot to do with its actual celebration. And we're very lucky to have Bob at the Library of Congress in this leadership role, and I'd like to welcome you to have you welcome me to the podium. Thank you very much. Have you helped me welcome him to the podium?
Thanks very much, John. I do appreciate that introduction. The Veterans History Project is very pleased to be co-hosting this event with the Center for the Book. And as John mentioned, in truth, we are commemorating a trio of important occasions. First is this year marks the 100th anniversary of the beginning of World War I. VHP is doing all we can to commemorate that, and part of it is this week we are launching not our first but our second web presentation using the interviews that we have in the Veterans History Project through our Experiencing War series. We'll be launching that website later this week, so please go to our website and take a look at that. It again highlights about a dozen or so participants in World War I and some of the materials that comes along with their collection. Second, in case I have to tell everybody, next week is Veterans Day, a date when we as a nation take time to thank those who have served and sacrificed our nation. We in VHP like to take it a little bit further, and we're encouraging everyone to make Veterans Day a little bit more meaningful. Certainly thank the veteran in your life, the veteran in your community, but also take the opportunity to hear his or her story. And you can do that through the Veterans History Project. Finally, in September, the library opened an important exhibit over in the Jefferson Building. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to go over and take a look at it. It spotlights the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And today's book talk on the Harlem Rattlers, the 369th Regiment, will bring to mind some of those who were singular figures in the cause for equal rights in the early 20th century. I said the Veterans History Project collects stories and on veterans. Every one of you in this audience, I know, has a veteran in your life. And I would encourage you to think about sitting down and talking to that veteran, not just next week, but during the course of the holiday season and beyond. And if you'd like to get involved with the Veterans History Project, some of our staff is here to talk to you about it after the program. But we also have materials on the back, and the table in the back that you pick up on your way out to learn again how you can be part of the Veterans History Project and enrich the archive here at the Library of Congress. A recent journal of military history book review of the Harlem Rattlers and the Great War stated, "This book belongs on the shelf of any serious student of the 15th to 369th Regiment, American involvement in World War I, race relations in the early 20th century, and African American history." We are very honored to have both authors of this book with us today. Jeffrey T. Sammons is a professor in the Department of History at New York University, where he has taught since 1989. He began his academic career at the University of Houston and a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Cape Town before being named in 1987 a Henry Rutgers Research Fellow at Rutgers University, Camden, where he completed his critically acclaimed Beyond the Ring, the Role of Boxing in American Society. Dr. Sammons has also taught at Princeton University and at Hollins University as the Jessie Ball DuPont Scholar. In 2001, he was awarded a fellowship by the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture and History, and soon after received the National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship in support of what became Harlem Rattlers and the Great War. Dr. Sammons is a National Senator of the Phi Beta Kappa Society and a member of the Museum and the Library Committee of the United States Golf Association, and is at work on a book about race and golf. John H. Morrow, Jr., Franklin Professor of History at the University of Georgia, earned his BA with honors in history from Swarthmore College and his PhD in modern European history from the University of Pennsylvania. In 1971, Professor Morrow became the first African-American faculty member in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, where he taught for 17 years. Dr. Morrow served as head of the UTK History Department from 1983 to his departure from the university in 1988, and won numerous teaching awards there, as well as at the University of Georgia, where he served 2 terms as chair and was Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. He has been appointed to numerous visiting professorships in military history and has served on many prestigious advisory committees. He is the author of German Air Power in World War I and Building German Air Power. Morrow's book, The Great War and the Air, Military Aviation from 1909 to 1921, is considered the definitive study of air power in the First World War. His comprehensive history of the First World War, The Great War and an Imperial History, recently appeared in a centennial edition. And I want to add personally, he also has another great distinction. He's the father of a U.S. Army soldier and veteran of the Iraq War. I am also from the United States Army and the father of a son who was in the Iraq War, so I thank you and your family for their service. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeffrey Sammons, I believe, who's going to start off, and Dr. John Morrow.
Thank you, Mr. Cole, Center for the Study of the Book, and Bob Patrick for the Veterans History Project and the Library of Congress, and all of the people who are in attendance. I'd like to recognize a couple of individuals first. One is Lieutenant General retired Julius Becton, who was a member of the 369th Regiment in 1945. And if you've read Colin Powell's autobiography, you will see the credit that he gives to General Becton for his success in the United States Army. General Becton. Also like to recognize a veteran of another sort, and actually a prisoner of war of another sort, since we're so close to Veterans Day and we have a World War II veteran in the audience. This is my aunt, Miyako Fuji, who was interned in California in 1942, and has 2 sisters who are still surviving who were also interned as well. So we have Miyako Fuji. Will you please stand? And I'd like for all the veterans in the audience to stand up, please. Since we're talking today at the Library of Congress, it's only fitting that I should begin my talk with statement of or expression of my appreciation and gratitude for the support that I received from the Library of Congress, especially in terms of resources that were so helpful in constructing the story of especially the 15th New York National Guard, which would become the 369th. And I'll explain that 15th New York National Guard designation in a second. The William Howard Taft Papers constitute an important contribution to this book and its distinctiveness and uniqueness in telling the story of the 15th New York National Guard. Not only do we hear from President Taft, sort of indirectly, but from his secretary, Charles Hillis, and also from Henry L. Stimson, who was Secretary of War in the Taft administration. We also use the papers of the NAACP military section. And I think, yes, the person who is most responsible for pointing me in the right direction at the Library of Congress is a longtime friend. I think I met her when she first came here. I believe replaced Dr. Deborah Newman, who was at the National Archives when I was working on my master's thesis. I don't want to tell you how many years ago that was. And Ms. Cannon replaced Deborah Newman in the manuscripts division of the Library of Congress. Ms. Adrienne Cannon. And I still call her a couple of times a year asking questions about resources at the Library of Congress. Okay, let me start my talk by addressing the title of this book. And for some it's confusing. I was surprised the other day. I was at a meeting in my department about World War I programming, and the people in the room didn't know that the Harlem Hellfighters and the Harlem Rattlers were the same unit, right? So they thought I was writing about a different unit. So how did we come up with this name, Harlem's Rattlers? Well, simple. That is what the regiment called itself. And they were the Rattlers, not Harlem Rattlers, not Black Rattlers, not Harlem's Rattlers, but the Rattlers. And as you see from this commemorative history that was presented to Benjamin O. Davis Sr. in 1939, Benjamin O. Davis Sr. was the first black commander of the regiment and came out of the regular army to lead this group. And of course, prominent at the top and in the center of this commemorative history is the rattlesnake, which we sort of link to both Benjamin Franklin and the Gadsden flag, "Don't Tread on Me." So we have this unit, this black unit, adopting this indigenous American symbol of ferocity, and that, for example, is what Arthur Davis used as a title of his 1974 book. And Arthur Davis served briefly with the regiment, and his brother actually served overseas, and his book is titled Here and There with the Rattlers. If you see Arthur Little's book, on the cover of the hardback is this embossed image of the rattlesnake. And I don't believe that Arthur Little, who was a major in the regiment, an adjutant, who would go on to command it after the war, ever called them the Harlem Hellfighters. They were the old 15th, the fighting 15th, or the Rattlers. So where does Harlem Hellfighters come from? We believe, although it's been attributed to the Germans, along with Blutlistige Schwarzmanner, which is, as John will tell you, who's fluent in German, or bad, use of German, corruption of the language. We think it comes from the American press. But there's no question that the name stuck. And as Chad Williams recently wrote in a review of Patrick Lewis's children's book, written in free verse poetry and profusely illustrated, that it has symbolic power. it's alliterative, it's sensational, but there is something else that helped that name stick. And the fact of the matter is that James Reese Europe and his band went into a French recording studio, Pathé Records, and out of that recording studio came this album, and it was labeled Harlem Hellfighters Band. And in all the advertisements for the band after the war, we see Harlem Hellfighters. So the band used it, embraced it, and we believe helped for that label to stick. All right, what about the 15th New York National Guard? It is the first black National Guard unit recognized by the state of New York in 1916. Now let's put that into context. We had black units in the 1850s in New York. We had them in the 1860s. In fact, there were 3 black units that fought in the Civil War from New York, the 20th, the 26th, and the 31st. But they were not recognized by the state of New York. They were privately raised and sponsored. The Union League Club of New York was largely responsible for those 3 regiments that served in the Civil War. We had no black regiment from New York in the Spanish-American War. And guess what? Chicago has had a black unit recognized by the state of Illinois since 1878. And that unit would become the 8th Illinois. And it was officered from the top down by blacks. That unit would serve in the Spanish-American War and also in World War I as the 370th Regiment. Now, what happened in World War I was that the commander of the regiment was removed for health reasons. Does that story sound familiar? Well, Colonel Young, Charles Young, who should have been the first black general in the United States Army, the 3rd black graduate of West Point, was removed from active duty during the course of the war, sent to the Ohio National Guard, and the Ohio National Guard had been mobilized, so he had no real responsibilities there, was basically in exile. He was not allowed to speak in public. He rode a horse from Ohio to Washington to prove his fitness. And the cynics said that all he proved was that the horse was fit. So Colonel Young never did serve in World War I. He never reached the rank of general. And he was sent to Africa after the war, contracted a tropical disease, and died. And it's a tragedy for America that this man was treated in that way, but it's symbolic, it's representative of the way African Americans have been treated by the military in its history. So, New York is envious of Chicago. It says, how can we, call ourselves the black metropolis when Chicago has a National Guard regiment? But even more, how can we consider ourselves to be real citizens, true citizens, first-class citizens, if we're not allowed to be represented in the military? Remember what Frederick Douglass said in the Civil War, that if blacks didn't fight, that freedom would lose half its luster. He believed that if we didn't fight in the Civil War, there was no way that we could prove that we were not craven cowards. So it was also about manhood, respectability, capability. So this is on the mind of New Yorkers. And let me tell you, New York is a tough place for black people. Many don't realize that. In the 1850s, blacks organized military units for self-protection, self-defense. In the middle of the Civil War, we have the draft riots in New York City, in which hundreds of black people are killed, in which their homes are destroyed, run out of the city in the middle of the Civil War. So they know that military representation is very important. We know that from the Revolutionary War, when blacks fought for their freedom. In 1910, blacks decide, because of their growing political influence and numbers in New York City, that it's time to take seriously the matter of military representation. So they form an organization called the Equity Congress of Greater New York, which is concerned about political representation by blacks, about the way blacks are being treated in New York City and state, about the lack of representation on the police force and in the fire department. New York doesn't have its first black policeman until 1911, Samuel J. Battle. And one of the things that the Equity Congress is committed to doing is establishing a black National Guard regiment in the city and in the state. So almost out of nowhere comes Charles Ward Fillmore. Actually, he comes from Ohio. He was a veteran of the National Guard in Ohio and rose to the rank of major, but also served in the Spanish-American War and served with the 9th Volunteer Regiment, known as the Colored Immunes. Why were they called the Colored Immunes? Because there was this belief or notion that blacks were immune to tropical diseases such as yellow fever and malaria. So blacks served in the Spanish-American War, many as nurses caring for those with tropical diseases, and guess what? Many blacks contract malaria, yellow fever, and die. And Charles Ward Fillmore actually contracted malaria but survived. So he led the movement in New York for a black regiment. 1910 is the start, right? And I said that we don't have recognition of the 15th New York National Guard until 1916. That's a long time to start an effort to establish a regiment. And actually it's a continuation, but a kind of, this time, concerted effort to do it. So they're working with the Taft administration, or trying to work with the Taft administration. But what we find is that the Republicans at the time are taking blacks for granted. And the Democrats are using how the Republicans are not doing anything for blacks to their advantage, and especially in New York City with Tammany Hall. One Republican official, I think his name was Lemuel Queeg, said you couldn't drive blacks out of the Republican Party with a sledgehammer. But this Equity Congress understood that they couldn't depend on Republicans, just as they couldn't depend on Democrats, so they had to try to work both sides against the middle. So this Equity Congress was supposed to be nonpartisan. It was actually multi-partisan. And so there were these attempts to elect officials who would support a regiment, or to try to defeat those who would be against it. There were numerous attempts at passing legislation to establish a regiment, met with failure time and time again. And then finally in 1913, a bill passes both houses of the New York State Legislature for the establishment of a colored regiment of infantry. The bill was signed into law by Governor William Sulcer, a Democrat. And I forgot to mention that we had National Guard adjutant generals who were Republicans who were actually arguing against the establishment of a black regiment in the National Guard in New York State. And why is that? One, really don't want blacks to prove themselves competent in military organizations, but also the National Guard was as much a social club, if not more at this time, than a military organization. We hear of the people wearing gold braids and shining at pink tees. They were often known as ballroom heroes in the National Guard. So there was a lot of social prestige attached to National Guard service. And there's no way that these white officers and men wanted blacks to be on the same level with them, and certainly not to socialize with them. And the National Guard in New York is led by Major General John F. O'Ryan. And I hate to say this, but you know, the Irish and Irish Americans were no friends of blacks in New York. And neither was Tammany Hall, which was dominated by Irish and Irish Americans. All right? So, there's a law. It says there must be a black regiment of infantry established within 90 days of this law's passage in 1913, June of 1913. Well, little did many people know, but the National Guard leadership in New York, and with help from Washington, was working to thwart the actual realization of this regiment. How would they do that? Well, one of the things, it was so easy for them, was to fail every man who came forward for the officer examination. And they also decided that they would form the regiment company by company. All right? Not even by battalion, but by company, right? A small unit. So, what was it, 57 men come up for exams and only 2 pass, and one of those was a chaplain, and all he had to do was prove his credentials were legitimate for the clergy. So, my Marco Rubio moment. So the National Guard leadership in New York in 1914 says that the regiment experience is dead. No need to go forward. Well, Charles Fillmore, who's still a part of the Equity Congress, establishes a provisional regiment of infantry to prove that blacks could do this, to have something on the ground to show interest, to also have something for them to dismantle, to work against. And he keeps at it. And finally, the political winds change. In 1916, Charles Seymour Whitman is elected governor of New York, and he is a pro-war Republican. The winds of war are also shifting. America is moving closer to intervention. We also have something happening on the Mexican border, so-called police action against Pancho Villa. Many New York National Guardsmen are called to duty on the Mexican border. There's a manpower shortage in New York State, and Charles Whitman says that he is going to authorize a black regiment. Blacks deserved it. It was their right. It was his duty. And in June of 1916, we have the actual organization of the 15th New York National Guard. However, there are a lot of buts that are attached to that organization. It has a white commander, Colonel William Hayward from Nebraska. I'll say one thing and John will say more about Hayward. He was the right man for the job under the circumstances. There's no way that a black commander would have been accepted by the National Guard in New York or the Militia Bureau or National Guard Bureau in Washington. In fact, the head of that bureau, Mann, was working closely with Orion to ensure that that didn't happen. In fact, Orion had told Mann there will be no black officers in the regiment when they take the higher standards in the federal examination required for federal recognition. Well, he was wrong about that. When they went overseas, they did have 5 black officers. But as I said before, they would not get a black commander until 1939, 23 years after formal recognition of the regiment in New York State. I'm going to let my co-author pick up the story. We'll actually go back to the video, the slides at the end, if somebody could help me with the technical difficulty. Okay. All right, John?
I can thank the Library of Congress not for this book, but because I actually worked here for some of my earlier books on World War I. My job here when Jeff asked me to join him was to use my expertise in the history of the First World War and in Europe and skills in French to study the regiment abroad in combat. Because ironically, of all the previous books that have been written on the 369th, none of the authors ever visited the French archives, yet the 369th fought in the French army in the First World War. So that's one thing we have to explain. I had the difficult task, as I often kid Jeff, of having to go to Paris while he labored hard in the vineyards of the Library of Congress, the National Archives here, to the Chateau de Vincennes, which is where the military archives are, and spend a couple of summers there, and then rent a car and drive to the battlefields of France, where the 369th and my great uncle had fought in the 368th in the First World War, to trek the battlefields. Jeff could not take the last part of that, and so he came and visited the battlefields and even found new battlefields to visit. So we both did that, but as I often lament, I got the really tough end of the stick there. But we worked very well together on this, and it's very much of a joint work. What you see is that once the regiment has been authorized, Hayward is the right man, because Hayward firmly believed, as a Nebraskan who had been a football and baseball star there, who had actually been taught in ROTC by John J. Pershing, Hayward believed, quote, that the great colored population of New York ought to be given an opportunity to shine in the National Guard without prejudice. And so when he went out to recruit, he not only got officers from prominent New York families such as Captain Hamilton Ham Fish, who was a scion of a very prominent upstate New York family, who at that point in time was a good friend of Franklin D. Roosevelt's, would later on become his arch enemy in politics, and also his adjutant, Captain and Major Arthur Little, was a prominent New York publisher who as well had connections to Colonel Edward House. People will know that's Wilson's confidential advisor. But he also recruited African American officers. And one of his key recruits, because every good regiment needs a band, all right? That's how you attract people to the colors in those days, National Guard regiment. And Hayward recruits the best band leader going, James Reese Europe, who had been the band director for Vernon and Irene Castle, that famous dance team. And they basically popularized the foxtrot. So James Reese Europe was internationally known, and what happened was Hayward persuaded him to become the band leader of the 15th New York National Guard. He consented and developed, as we shall see, the finest band of any regiment in the Army, and it was the band that ultimately took jazz to Europe in 1918, 1919. It was Pershing's favorite band. Pétain loved it. They traveled everywhere. In fact, one of the difficulties with previous histories is that they seem to forget that the band was an appendage of the regiment. A lot of them portray the band as the key part of the regiment and forget this is actually a famous fighting regiment. And it happens to have this marvelous band because Hayward recruited them. Hayward also succeeds in attracting, it's also worth remembering that James Reese Europe may have been the band director. Initially, he was not. He was actually a lieutenant in the machine gun company and was gassed at the front. In fact, one of his famous songs that's still on the album, Ain't It Grand, Out in No Man's Land, he wrote when he was recovering from gas in a French hospital behind the lines. So he's not just the band leader, he is an officer in the regiment. But with two captains, Fillmore, whom Jeff has already told you about, and another very appropriately named Napoleon Bonaparte Marshall. If you've got to fight in the French army, that's a good name to have. It just so happened he was a Harvard-trained lawyer who had defended the black troops in the Brownsville trial back in 1905, 1906. And one thing to emphasize, and that's often forgotten, the New York National Guard, 15th, was endowed with a tremendous black non-commissioned officer cadre. That's something that new historians of the American Expeditionary Forces have noted, that their non-commissioned officers, often the junior commissioned officers, were subpar. Not the case of the New York National Guard 15th. These are men who volunteered. Many of them had actually already been in the regular army, came back to rise through the ranks. Keep that in mind. The trouble is, though, you have a regiment. Nobody wants the regiment. The 15th of New York applies to join the 42nd Division, so-called the Rainbow. The response from the Rainbow Division is, black is not a color of the rainbow. Ha-ha. Neither is white, okay? But nobody ever brings that up. The 6th New York National Guard Division doesn't want the 15th National Guard, and the 6th New York will later become the 27th Division in the AEF. It will not reach combat until long after the 15th New York is in combat. The 15th heads to Europe because it can't find anywhere to train. It's sent to Spartanburg, South Carolina, a brilliant decision. This is where you should send an African-American regiment. They don't want to go there. The citizens of Spartanburg don't want them to be there. And there's a near repetition of the Houston events of August 1917, where the troops almost march on the town. They get them out of there. They decide time to send them to France. They get to Camp Mills in New York State, and they run into the 167th Alabama Regiment, which will be part of the 42nd Rainbow. And the Alabamians don't like them for some reason or another. But unfortunately for the Alabamians, they're tangling with the wrong unit, because every place they had been, they got into fights. They'd been in fights with the Ohio Regiment trying to reenact the Civil War. The mistake here is that the 15th New York National Guard has professional boxers within its ranks. One, George Kid Cotton, had been a sparring partner with Jack Johnson. And within the short period of time that they were there before the 15th was sent away again, this time to France, George Kid Cotton noted that, sorry to have to leave this camp, have a lot of fights on the card, already have 2 knockouts, expect to get more. The United States just isn't the place. They send them to France in mid-December in hopes that, well, they'll have a better time in France. What Colonel Hayward doesn't know, though, is that this regiment that he deems a fighting regiment, a volunteer regiment, is actually intended for labor duties in the American Expeditionary Forces. Because when the notion that there would be 4 units, 3 of them National Guard, and 1, which was a drafted unit from South Carolina, all black, that were going to be sent, they were all deemed to be labor units. And when the 15th New York National Guard arrives in France, it automatically is set to labor duties at Montoire, which is a base not far from Saint-Nazaire, which is the port. And a number of the men succumb to flu and measles because the conditions there are horrible, the billets are horrible, the food is horrible. And Hayward's desperately trying to get them out of there. The Deus Ex Machina that does get them out of this, because they would have been labor units for the rest of the war, is General Philippe Pétain, who's the commander-in-chief of the French army on the Western Front. Pétain knows that the 369th, they don't know they're the 369th. The French know, but the 15th doesn't. That there will be 4 regiments, the 369th, the 370th, the 371st, the 372nd coming. The 369th is the first. And Pétain, once the regiment arrives on New Year's Day in 1918, says to Pershing, French army desperately needs men. You have 4 divisions of African American soldiers arriving. I want them in the French army. Well, Pétain has already encountered a stone wall from Pershing asking him for any troops. He won't give him any white troops because, remember, the AEF is supposed to develop into a force of its own. And Pershing caught the dilemmas, decides, all right. And so he says to Pétain, you get the 15th, and you'll get the next 3 of those units, guard units coming. Pétain informs him within the week that he is pleased about that, and that these units will become combat units in the French army. They will be infantry units. Well, it's very fascinating. The men are overjoyed about this, everyone, from top down, because they've come to fight. When they get to the French officer they first meet says to them, bienvenue, or welcome, the 369e Regiment, which means the 369th. And Hayward is thinking, who is the 369th? We're the 15th New York National Guard. That's the first time that they know they will be labeled the 369th. And it's an insult. because numbers in the 300s apply only to draftee regiments, and they are a volunteer unit. They always call themselves the 15th, and they call themselves the Rattlers. So this number, the new number that we know them by, that they became famous by, is actually something that they don't find until they get to the French. And the French, when Hayward calls his unit Les Enfants Perdus, the French, which means the lost children, the French officer with the sign that says English speaking here, of course French style, says, "Welcome, little black baby," which means little black baby, if you need a translation. But these men are ready to go. In March, they begin training. By April, they are ready for the front. They have excelled in their training in all phases of it, from the machine gun work to the normal practicing, because they have French equipment. The Lebel rifle is long with a cruciform-like bayonet that's 2 feet long. They're excellent at fencing, as they call it, escrime avec la baïonnette, which means fencing with the bayonet. They're great with that because some of that presumes boxing. If you're a good boxer, you can move to use the bayonet. The other thing that they excel in, and the French noted it, was grenade throwing. They could throw grenades 30 meters than any comparable Frenchman. Why? Because we play baseball. So that was not unusual. But they have French equipment. They have the French blue casque Adrien, the blue Adrian helmet. And when Hamilton Fish writes to his father as they're about to go into the front, "I am a great believer in the fighting quality of the educated American Negro, provided he is well led. If the regiment does not make a splendid record, it will be the fault of the officers." They are attached to the 16th French Division. The officers and men of the French unit, they're attached to get along brilliantly with the African Americans. And by April, they have filtered into the front lines with the French. They are in combat. They begin their night patrols on April 17th. And the French, the officers of the 369th, and American observation officers who come to visit say, this regiment is going to be an elite combat regiment. They have all the makings of it. They're ready to fight. They're well prepared. Fish in the first month or so says, "Oh, yeah, this is a great war, except for the gas, and the rats too as well, which were part of it." But the main thing is that they do very well from the very beginning. May 15th, Henry Roberts and Needham Johnson, 2 privates, are caught in a German attack on their observation post by, as near as we can tell, 20 to 24 Germans. Both are seriously wounded, but they drive off the German patrol. Johnson manages to shoot one, use his bolo knife to kill 2 more, and then a third, and finally kills a 4th with a grenade as the Germans are retreating. And Needham Roberts, who is badly wounded from the very beginning, spends the time throwing grenades at the Germans. These are the first 2 American soldiers to be awarded the French Croix de Guerre, the War Cross, with the gold palm and the silver palm. They make all the news. They make Pershing's first set of what were called communiques to the home front. It's fascinating, though. The articles on them begin, "2 strapping American Negroes." And it's worth it to note that the men will disappear in a welter of myth. Johnson, that strapping young black man, was 5 feet 6 inches tall and 129 pounds. So it's hard to get them right from the very beginning. It's interesting to note as well that while Johnson will be heavily decorated, he will be awarded the Purple Heart from the United States of America only in 1996, and the Distinguished Service Cross in 2003, after the political efforts of Senator Charles Schumer. And if you want to know more about those, Jeff was intimately involved and is still intimately involved in the efforts to get him the Medal of Honor. There are similar episodes. Sergeant William Butler in August basically saves his lieutenant and 4 men from capture. He has what's called a show shot, which is an automatic rifle that Americans deride all the time. The real problem with the show shot was the Americans insisted on trying to shift it to American-made caliber bullets, and the shift doesn't work very well. The 369th never complained about it, but Johnson literally rises up on signal and guns down 5 Germans who are trying to capture his men while the lieutenant and the others go to ground. The bullets literally rip the arm off the German lieutenant leading the patrol, at which point Butler, as he later says, when he went, "I just ran amok," disappears into the darkness, yelling, shouting, firing his show shot as he heads into the German trenches, throwing grenades, and finally comes back when he's exhausted his grenades and shot all of his bullets, and will later be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, but he just says, "I ran amok." Can't explain it. It's interesting to note, though, 369th never lost a man to capture by the Germans, which is an extraordinary feat. It never lost a foot of ground to the Germans, and it served 191 days, continuous days at the front, the longest of any comparable American unit. So its record is outstanding. The irony of it is that the American Expeditionary Forces spend their time trying to muck them up, in the sense that they first make certain that all of the officers in the 369th will be white, which is disruptive because that means that any black non-com who wishes to become an officer, a commissioned officer, will have to leave the regiment. Fortunately, many of them are so loyal that they do not. Then the AEF wants to take them back into the American Expeditionary Forces in August, prompting this atrocious Lonard Memorandum, which says to the French army, stop treating the American blacks as equals, and don't let any American blacks associate with French women, because this enrages white Americans who deem them inferior, and they will always have to be segregated. It's an extremely embarrassing memorandum, but the American army wants them back. And when it happens, when Pershing asks for them back in August, it goes all the way up to Foch. Foch writes Pershing very curtly, "If I give them to you to return to labor duties, I will have to disband 2 fighting French divisions. That is more of an inconvenience to me than it could be a convenience to you." End of story. The regiments will go back in December 1918. The 369th participates well in the Meuse, Argonne, and Champagne offensives at the end of September, beginning of October. They seize the village of Seychelles. It is worth it to note that the white commissioned officers commend their black soldiers, because in many cases all the commissioned officers are killed, and the black non-coms carry on and take the position. And in December, after being decorated by the French with the Croix de Guerre as a regiment, the 369th returns to the American lines. Upon their return to the American lines, when they get off the train, one of the black privates is trying to find a latrine. His captain, his commander, Major Little, suddenly hears from the men that an MP has cracked the skull of this young man, and Little heads for the site. And when he gets there, he and asks the MP, why have you done this? The MP arrogantly looks at him and says, we've been warned that your niggers are feeling their oats a bit, and we have our instructions to take it out of them quickly. At the end of a month before they returned to the United States, Captain Lewis Shaw, in his last letter home to his mother, Lewis Shaw is a very highly decorated white officer, says, I have been through more hell in the last month than the rest of my experience over here. When we started to be re-Americanized, they certainly did things to us which the censorship forbids my repeating. I am okay physically, but so low mentally as we all are at our treatment that I can't write a decent letter. Imagine how the black soldiers felt if a white officer felt that badly after the treatment they received returning to the AEF lines. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. Just wanted to run through a few slides that are from images in the book. Burt Williams also helped in the recruitment. Most people are not used to seeing Burt Williams look like that. There's Colonel Young in uniform heading off to his death in Africa. This is the 15th in Harlem, both trained. This guy is you have to read the book, is a con man who almost brought down the regiment single-handed, killed a fellow soldier. The men in the trenches, French helmets, equipment, but American uniforms. Over there, two gentlemen who are supposed to be Needham Roberts and Henry Johnson, and they're not. Here are Henry and Needham. Needham was 16 during that encounter. There is a stylized version of it. And then we have a few men from the regiment in paintings by Raymond Devereaux. The band, led by James Rees Short. Some more of those Devereaux paintings. Is that Seychelles, John, right there? Yeah, and the monument, which they didn't get until 1997, and really had to pay for the regiment themselves. This is Hartmann's Villerskopf, or Viel Armand, Little Armand in the Vosges Mountains. John didn't have time to mention that this was part of their final campaign. And here's a plaque to the regiment in that monument, and that's my photograph, so that's one of the things I did when I was over there.
That map that was their position in the line from the Rhine, on the Rhine River at the end of the war. They ended up not.
And there's First to the Rhine, a famous painting by Wolfe, and then some Hamilton Fish, Charles Ward Fillmore, and Butler, and Velasquez George, and mothers and widows of the soldiers. And then Hayward with some of the men with the Croix de Guerre. There's Henry, that strapping fellow that John talked about. The parade, party, the armory, General Benjamin O. Davis Sr., and then Chauncey Hooper, who was a sergeant major in the regiment in World War I, would become its second black commander, and I consider him really the first one, and he stayed for quite some time as the commander. And then a riff on Flanders Field by Andy. And then here's a Charles Rogers rendering of the Battle of Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts, and quite a beastly figure there in the form of Henry Johnson, and that's leading to that chapter in our book. Any comment? I think looks like a line. Any questions, ma'am?
Could you speak on the recruitment of Puerto Ricans to the Union?
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, she asked about the recruitment of Puerto Ricans to the regiment. That's something that we didn't get into a lot of depth on. The story is that they were recruited mostly for the band. There was a shortage of reed players, or York felt that the best reed players were from Puerto Rico and Cuba, so he recruited, and most of our treatment of the Puerto Ricans in the regiment have to do with the band. There is a book on it. I can't think of the title offhand. Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering if they encountered other soldiers of African descent, for example, from the Caribbean Islands or from Africa, like from Senegal.
John, what you
They
said.
do.
John, would you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, the question is, do they encounter other soldiers of African descent? They are, in fact, teamed with a Moroccan division in the final assaults during the battles. And it's interesting because they really can't tell the difference themselves. They don't know the difference between the different types of soldiers, different African soldiers. They do know that when they first arrived in the 16th Division, the French general had to explain to his men, he said, these are not Central African savages. Of course, the problem is that all the Africans who served with the French were not from Central Africa. The Moroccans, they noted, never gave a German a chance, liked to use the blade, and the one thing one of the soldiers observed is every time a French officer would pass this Moroccan soldier he happened to be in a foxhole with, the Moroccan soldier would say, pas bon, which means no good. But that's as much of a contact as they had.
And we did find, though, that they sometimes the African American soldiers would sort of accept the stereotypes of some of the African soldiers, and one of them was that they couldn't stand shell fire. And John can speak to that briefly.
That's something that a lot of people, they accuse Indian soldiers of not being able to stand up to shell fire, African soldiers. They also accused African American soldiers. This is a canard. It's simply not true in the sense that for the reports we actually have, and I have seen some of the reports on the Senegalese, and a former student of mine has actually written a book on them. That's not the case. It's difficult for anybody to stand up to shell fire, the bottom line is, but they often accuse the African soldiers of being superstitious. My only response to that is, anyone who recalls the Battle of Mons in 1914, where British soldiers saw an angel appear in the heavens above them, they're all superstitious. Okay?
Last question? Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a website?
I do not have a website. What would you like to know?
I shared so much.
Okay. Well, I'll get your information, but that's something that we thought about, and we'll have to consider. You tell me exactly what you'd be looking for on a website. Help me make the argument to get funding for it. Okay.
And Jeff will do the website because I'm a technological Luddite.
Somebody will do the website for me.
We have time for one more question. Go ahead.
Is there a successor unit? Is the 369 still in existence in some form?
Yes. Interesting. I'm glad you asked that question, because the regiment was actually decommissioned after the war. There was no 369th Regiment of Infantry, New York National Guard, U.S. Army, whatever, as of February probably 20th, 1919. There was a 3-year effort to recommission the regiment, which happened in 1922, and that's when Arthur Little became its commander. And one of the deals again with Orion was that most of the officers from this, there was a 15th New York Guard, which was a home guard that was in place during the war, and it stayed in place. And many of the men came back and went into that 15th New York Guard, including Charles Fillmore, who thought that he would become the commander of it. But when Little was being positioned to become the commander of what would become the 369th again, Orion said you have to get rid of most of the black officers. And so did the War Department. Then there are a number, what happens when Benjamin O. Davis Sr. becomes the commander in 1939 is that the regiment becomes an anti-aircraft artillery unit. It's no longer infantry. And then it goes through all kinds of permutations after that, transportation, you name it. Even loses its designation. At one point it's the 869. And it's still in existence as the 369 Brigade, but it's not infantry. It's some kind of service organization.
Well, stay here for just a second. Well, I'd like to thank Jeff and John for a wonderful presentation. Do you realize what they have done in this book, and we are just getting a smidgen of it, is to take, a military history, of course, about African Americans, but moving it into the larger story of civil rights, which Bob has mentioned as part of the exhibit that's at the Library of Congress now. And by taking that into social history, they have come at this subject from so many perspectives. And I managed to browse the book this weekend. It's a big one. But I was just amazed and enchanted by the perspectives and the breadth of what they tell, even with all those numbered regiments that you can't keep track of. The story is really important, and it's a wonderful event and a wonderful thing for the Library of Congress to be used for in the research, but also to be able to host today. And I would like to thank not only Bob Patrick, but Jeff Simmons and John Morrow for a wonderful presentation, and invite you first to join me in thanking them and stay for the book signing. Let's give everyone a round of applause. Thank you very much. I have to run this.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.